Hi, everyone. This is Heena Lotus from Heena Lotus Media. I am a geopolitical analyst for anyone that hasn't been introduced to me before. I have my co-host, Haydar. We are starting something brand new. I'm sure plenty of people have already watched it. If not, please check it out. We did a three-part series called Pakistan Decoded. It did extremely well. We had a lot of questions, we had criticism, we had people that learned a lot, we had people who wanted to learn more, and we realized that we were really onto something. So we started a little segment per se that we want to do every week. I'm going to let Haydar kind of, introduce it and talk about it, especially because this was honestly his idea and I think it's brilliant. But that all being said and done, we just want to, see you guys every week. Hopefully, we can start live streaming soon. We did have a couple of technical difficulties, so we apologize for that. But we want to go over current events. We want to go over and, decode things in the news. And we want to break it down from a anti-imperialist perspective. I know there's a lot of media, a lot of resources, a lot of podcasting out there, but I think the level of analysis that Heather and I kind of provide and the research we do is going to provide a new angle to our audience. That all being said and done, just wanted to introduce Heather, my co-host. You may know him, you may not, but Heather, if you want to give a quick introduction and talk about the project we're doing, we'll get right into it afterwards.
Of course, thank you so much, Sheena, for that incredible introduction. Yeah, it's really exciting because we have so much to say. There's always so much going on, and I feel that this is, unfortunately, the perfect time to kind of start unraveling everything in terms of what's going on. Because again, there seems to be just an overload in terms of information and in processing and kind of making sense of what's really going on. It can be something that's very difficult. And so that's why we wanted to, start this series where we get together and provide a more substantial breakdown of how things are happening, why they're happening in this way, and what direction we kind of see things moving in. So again, I'm very excited to be a part of this. I'm very excited that we've taking this opportunity to collaborate in this way. And I think it's necessary work because, as you said, there are, tons and tons of brilliant people out there, a lot of incredible shows and platforms that exist. But I think the sort of perspective, particularly from an anti-imperialist point of view, as well as, having that sort of Muslim-centric perspective added will be something that will really go a long way, and I hope that everyone's able to benefit and gain, knowledge from what we have to say.
And don't forget to tell them what our new project is called. I'm going to let you introduce it because it is your baby.
Thank you. So yeah, we've decided to call it Decoded, and hopefully the plan is that week by week we kind of decode things in the realm of geopolitics and anti-imperialism. Again, with different subject matters, with different topics that we're going to be kind of picking apart and providing a more substantive insight on.
Yeah, and we're super, excited for that. Of course, I have to get this out of the way. Please like, comment, share, subscribe. Please, share this link with people that you think will be interested. Please make sure to tune in every week. Hopefully, we can start doing this consistently, maybe even start doing it a couple times a week, depending on the reception. And I think the most important thing is if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, please put them in the comments. The reason why that's very important for us is we want to be interactive with our audience. We know that there's a lot of disinformation. Obviously, an extension of US foreign policy is the information warfare. And the only way that we can get through it is to know what our audience wants to learn about, what questions they have, where, they feel like there's holes in, all the headlines and everything going on. We want to be able to fill in those gaps. We are going to be researching, we're going to be going through headlines, we're going to be, picking up all the questions and comments that we're getting from our audience as well. And hopefully we can all learn and grow together and understand how this affects us on an individual level, We want to, make sure that we understand how this affects us as an ummah. We want to make sure we understand how this affects us in the Western world and, just the global economy and, everyone collectively as well. Because as a byproduct of what a multitude of different governments are doing, regardless of where you lean politically, we are all being affected. And I think the only way that we can understand this and make better decisions is to be educated on it. I hope that, as, Heather and I grow, we become one of your main sources in doing so. So, please, again, like, comment, share, subscribe. And if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, even if you have any sort of, feedback or criticism, please let us know. I think for me, I view this as a collective project, and the only way that we can make it, the best of its ability per se is if we have your insight and your feedback as well. But that all being said and done, I'm gonna let Heather kind of take the reins. We have a lot to cover tonight. We're not gonna make this a three-part series or anything like that. We are gonna try to keep these like short and sweet every week so we can kind of go over the headlines and cover as much as we need to. But I'm gonna let him kind of get started because I know we have a lot to cover tonight.
Yeah, thank you again, Hina, for that introduction and for providing that sort of insight on what we're going to be doing. Uh, so yeah, let's just get straight into it. I know there's a lot that has happened since the last time we did our podcast series, since its release, in terms of discussing everything pertaining to Pakistan in recent times. And it's just been a very a very heavy moment with everything that's going on in Iran so soon after and subsequently at the same time, seeing everything that has happened in Gaza, as well as in Lebanon that's been unfolding as well. And I think uh, to kind of decipher where this is all coming from, there is um, two different set of ideologies that we kind of have to understand, and what really makes Trump's decision to go into Iran at this particular moment and not another one. And I think again we saw last year where they kind of during the 12-day war they kind of initiated this process of just getting a feel of where Iran stands, what their capabilities are like, and what things could look like if they fully engaged Iran militarily. And I think what they kind of picked up from that was that, okay, Iran isn't simply going to sit back because we saw, a number of strikes or waves of strikes take place targeting Israel at that time, as well as, sort of symbolic strikes against, air bases in Qatar, I believe. And they kind of left it at that because that was
And they had done it, not
seen.
to interrupt you, but they had done it in the middle of
Oh,
negotiations. I think that is something that is insane at the end of the day. That's when like the 12-day war
absolutely,
started.
absolutely. Yeah, exactly. And then it's it's been consistent in terms of that again you saw that Iran is willing to come to the table. There's this whole frenzy around Iranian nuclear weapons. There's this whole obsession with regulating Iran, and like I'm sure as you can relate, I've seen this. I genuinely kid you not, I remember in 2004, I'm 8, 9 year old kid. I'm watching BBC. I'm seeing the IAEA head talking about the need to look into Iran's nuclear programs and their nuclear capabilities. And I remember from those days reports stating that, specific Iranian scientists had been assassinated in Iran. And so this has been a very long overdue sort of culmination to this whole fiasco in regards to, does Iran have nuclear weapons? Is it building nuclear capabilities? What are those capabilities going to be for? And I think that kind of brings us to this moment. Well, before I talk further about that, I think it's important to point out the fact that Iran, even if it was pursuing nuclear capabilities, only started to do that after the Iran-Iraq War. And what happened during that, during the 1980s, where you had an 8 year, conflict between Iran and Iraq, where again, the moment that the revolution takes place in Iran and the Shah is overthrown and ousted, that this, uh, this sort of pantomime villain emerges of this, revolutionary Islamic state, this like extremely authoritarian, brutal entity that needs to be confronted and needs to be eliminated from the offset. And it comes to, represent this, like boogeyman in the Western imagination. And so that's kind of where this all, extends out of. And what does the US do during that time? They provide not just, a plethora of weapons to Saddam Hussein to use on their behalf in taking on Iran. They specifically give him chemical weapons to use against Iran. And it was a very, very horrifying war that again is not talked enough about. The amount of civilians, especially Iranians, who lost their lives in the hundreds of thousands, if I'm not mistaken, as well as you had civilian aircrafts obliterated out of the sky by the U.S. And at the time, George H.W. Bush said that that was something he was willing to do, and he openly, he refused to apologize for it. So out of that, you have this fear that exists in Iran that we're never gonna be safe from imperialist violence, from this threat that the U.S. will always kind of attempt to detract our revolutionary state, to impede it in some way. And that's kind of where, things have always been in terms of, the sanctions that have lasted decades and decades, and the varying degrees of sanctions, because it's just gotten worse and worse over time, especially since I think 2017, 18, during the first Trump administration when you had this they obviously they ripped up the
The
agreement that
JCPOA,
Iran
the
and
nuclear Iran nuclear deal. So yeah, what Hader's basically saying is, in under Obama, there was something called JCPOA, and it's what, was coined as like the Iranian, nuclear deal. It was talked about a lot in the headlines, and it basically was this program set up under, Obama, where, for layman's terms, it was basically saying, hey, as long as Iran is able to not enrich over a certain point, as long as they're following all our rules and regulations, we will lift the sanctions and we will allow them to do X, Y, and Z. And as we all know, under the Obama administration, even though Iran kept their end of the bargain, the Obama administration still ended up subjugating them in a multitude of ways and became more and more stringent and didn't lift sanctions to the magnitude that they should have. Once, Trump came in, his first administration, not the current one, he basically ripped up the entire, JCPOA, the nuclear deal, and said, all bets are off. And he actually tightened the sanctions and wasn't willing to negotiate in any capacity. The interesting thing about that, like, let's, bring it from all this history that, Heather and I just discussed to where we are right now. I think a lot of the way that Trump basically functioned in his first administration, we are seeing a continuation of that in this administration because, a multitude of times, ever since the Gaza, I don't want to call it a conflict, I don't want to call it a war, ever since the genocide in Gaza began under, Israel's bombardment, obviously being supported and funded by the United States, we saw how many times Iran was being threatened. It was always threatened since 1979, but it was amplified. We also saw during the 12-day war how things were heightened, and that was in the middle of negotiations. I feel like every time that negotiations have taken place between Iran and Israel or Iran and the West, you basically saw the United States say, hey, I know we're in the middle of negotiations, but we are going to create, some sort of violence. We're going to create some sort of deterrence. We are not willing to negotiate on fair grounds, right? Because, for example, if Heather and I wanted to negotiate, we would both sit down in neutral territory and talk things out, and it would be something that would be mutually beneficial for both of us. And what the US basically did was they were like, hey, we're willing to be fair, we're willing to be ethical, we want to do X, Y, and Z. And then right in the middle of these negotiations, Iran is getting bombed. You saw, even neutral territories like Qatar and Oman being, affected to a very great magnitude. And I think even right now, a lot of people in the headlines are saying, hey, what Iran is doing is not fair. This is affecting the global economy. We have the Strait of Hormuz, which we're going to get into detail about, affecting the entire markets, right? People that are aligned with the US and not aligned with the US. And as a byproduct of that, people are saying that what Iran is doing is unfair. But if we look at the history from 1979 until now, especially within the last few years, I think it's coming down to the fact that the United States had preemptive strikes, even though, even now headlines are coming out and saying, hey, Iran had no, they didn't show any signs of wanting to strike or doing anything, violent to begin with. They did not want to engage in this war. They were preparing for it. And now that the US has gotten Iran involved, Iran has the upper hand, not because of any sort of, you can say like financial, like backing or like military or weapons or anything of that nature. But I think because of the Strait of Hormuz and it being cut off, it's, kind of putting all the chips out on the table and putting Iran in a position where they are the dominant or winning power, at least as of right now. And as opposed to the United States conceding, right, after being given multiple, like, I guess, attempts of negotiation where they could have been fair and ethical, they didn't. And at this point, whatever Iran is doing is a byproduct of the very violent history that they've gone through. And throughout all of this, we also have to remember that, we saw the genocide in Gaza going on. We saw international law, not being respected in any capacity. We've seen Israel, obviously amp it up with Lebanon right now, but you see bombings in Lebanon, you see bombings in Iran, you see infrastructure being hit, civilian infrastructure being hit, the genocide, in Gaza being accelerated. We see, people in the West Bank also suffering who have nothing to do with Hamas. So I always have to remind people of that. And so what we're seeing right now, just as Haydar said, is a culmination of all of this very violent history. And so I think it's very important to remember, even though what Iran is doing right now may seem unfair, and that's what we're seeing in the headlines, if it doesn't take into account the history that got it there and, a byproduct of the geopolitics surrounding Iran and everything going on with Gaza, I think these headlines are being taken out of context. I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Undoubtedly, I think that's exactly what's happening. It's a very, purposeful, orchestrated decontextualization of what's really taken place. And as I was alluding to earlier, as you touched on yourself, this all stems from, these different forces combining and kind of confronting each other at this time. And I think what we're right now seeing is a very existential sort of conflict taking place in which Iran understands that if they don't take this fight to Israel and the United States, they aren't going to survive this. It's for their collective future, and as we've seen, the collective future of pretty much the entire world in itself as well, because you're standing up to this imperial behemoth. And for Israel, where it kind of sees itself, where it sees, the need or the necessity to confront Iran in this very moment, it again stems back to October 7th. It stems to what they unleashed upon Gaza, because at that point they understood that once we do this, once we initiate this process, we there's going to be no coming back from this. And of course there's, this sort of biblical prophecy, and there's a lot of this etymology that goes on in terms of that people do try to take into consideration. But I think even from a geopolitical standpoint, we can see that what Israel understood was that, okay, this has always been our plan in terms of, regional expansion, outright regional expansion, because of
And
course
it's
they've
called, not to
attempted to do
interrupt
this
you, it's called, and
numerous
this
times.
this terminology is so important for people to remember. This project is called the Greater Israeli Project or Expansion Project. And
Mm,
a lot of people said it was conjecture, a lot of people said it was just a theory, but what we are seeing right now in the midst of, the Gazan genocide as well as the Iran, US war, it's coming to fruition right now. And so it was not a theory, it wasn't just conjecture. And a lot of people who are very anti-resistance against the security architecture of Iran per se, they a lot of them would say, and I think it was a byproduct of maybe like propaganda and MSM and things of that nature. But people would say the reason there's instability in the region is because of these resistance groups, right? And that's how they were framed. Like they're causing a lot of controversy, they're causing a lot of violence. But the very term resistance means that they're all collectively resisting the very same thing. And those are, very key things that we need to discuss. It would be colonialism, it would be imperialism, and it would be the Israeli expansion project. And I think right now, Lebanon itself is very quickly going through exactly what, we saw, Gaza go through for like the last few years. And I know repeatedly people who were anti-imperialist, people who considered themselves pro-Palestinian, people who understood the geopolitics of the region would repeatedly say, if we do not free Gaza, if we do not free Palestine, we are going to see this become the blueprint for, the entire region as a whole. And that is exactly what, is going on at this point. Didn't mean to interrupt you as usual. Please go on, Heather.
No, no, of course. That's exactly it because again, Israel has had this blueprint. It's always had this mandate, and that's kind of what's been at the core of Zionist ideology from the offset. They had this, projection for something much larger, for something that's regional. When you read through Theodore Herzl's earliest writings, he talks about how it isn't just this, quote unquote, holy land that's promised to them, it's a greater part of the Mediterranean region. He even makes claims to, islands and regions like Greece and Cyprus for the Jewish people. And it ultimately is an inherently Jewish supremacist doctrine, right, that they're following. And the day that we saw Israel go into Gaza, they clearly indicated um, their military leadership, as well as, people in the media in Israel, they're very clear that once we initiate things in Gaza, it means we're going to go into Lebanon, we're going to go into Syria, we're going to go into Iran. And again, we've seen with the fall or ousting of Bashar al-Assad in Syria that a seemingly more friendlier uh, leadership has emerged there, which is a bit more open to working with the United States and the Western Bloc, and not openly, but seemingly looks to be more friendlier towards Israeli interests as well. And not in terms of, direct collusion or outright partnership, but more so in terms of not being actively resistant to Israeli aggression. And that's kind of what we've seen so far because, when you've had Iranian missiles crossing from Syrian territory onto the way to strike targets in the occupied Palestinian territories, they've been struck down by Syrian forces as well as by Jordanian forces. So this is something, that again, there's, excuse me, there's such an interdependence in terms of everything that goes on in the region that you can't just leave it at saying, okay, this is about Israel, this is about America, this is about Iran, because you have to talk about how all of these forces are meshed together and ultimately they're tied together by the same forces as well. And as you were alluding to, what we specifically see with the Greater Israel Project is this desire to keep expanding. And what I was trying to get at earlier was the fact that, it's born out of that very much, European white supremacist doctrine that we've seen in centuries past, that the United States still harbors as kind of its, guiding principle. And I think that's kind of the point where we come to now is where, okay, Israel understands that they need to protect themselves and for once and for all go out there and take out all resistance to the Zionist project in the region. And the heart and the core of that is the Iranian regime, right? Quote unquote regime. That the revolutionary state needs to be dismantled, that, potentially the Iranian country itself needs to be broken up and sort of balkanized. And then that's kind of the only way that will assure that it doesn't remain a threat as it has to Israel in the past, because Israel has always understood that, and the reason why Iran has been subjugated to such extreme, harassment and punishment by the Western bloc, especially in terms of, economic ramifications, is because they all understood that Iran has been the singular force behind every resistance operation, behind every resistance action, whether that's a missile from Yemen or Ansarallah, or if that's a rocket strike from Hezbollah, if that's, Hamas on the ground in Gaza resisting Israeli genocidal forces. It's been the direct implementation of what Iran sees as their duty and their responsibility. And what have they been carrying out is that, responsibility of aiding resistance materially against Zionist expansion. And so that's kind of where it all culminates in Israel understanding that they, in order to continue their expansionist project outside of just, colonizing Palestine, need to confront Iran and neutralize any and all resistance forces in the region. And Iran understanding that this is what they've been preparing for this entire time. And I think we'll kind of get into where the US fits into all of this and why they've kind of decided to partake in this excursion at this moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to kind of get into, I think Heather does a phenomenal job, by the way, in setting the grounds and going through the framework and the history. I'm so humbled to have you as a co-host. But that all being said and done, we do want to stick to current events. So let's kind of get into certain headlines that we've been all collectively seeing and break them down. I know, I asked basically our audience on our social media who, has questions and what they want to learn about. One of the most important questions that was asked was about the Strait of Hormuz. We know that it's been not completely shut down or closed off. I think that's improperly worded in the headlines, but it has been basically shut down to anyone that is, Israel or US aligned and trading outside of yen, which is, Chinese currency. And there's a lot of other, rules and regulations that come with this. But as a byproduct of this, it is hitting the global economy on levels that have been unprecedented. And it's, posing a very, very big threat to the petrodollar. We also see the fact that barrels of oil, were at $100 last week. I know that's increasing to, much higher this week, and it will most likely continue at the rate that it's going. How would you frame why the Strait of Hormuz is so significant in this war, especially because we have to keep in mind when it comes to the Western Bloc, predominantly United States, like foreign policy and the way MSM has been reporting it. Trump has been kind of framing this war as, hey, the United States is winning. We have a lot more money. We have a lot more, infrastructure when it comes to military. We have, defense systems. We have missiles. We have X, Y, and Z. But one thing that wasn't taken into account is the fact that wars are not just won on like a military level, on a political level. It's also won through regional security architecture, like Iran has. It's also won through, economic benefits or sometimes geography, which is how the Strait of Hormuz comes into play. But how would you kind of decipher this entire situation and why it's so integral to Iran's current position in the war?
Yeah, I mean, there's a multitude of factors to understanding this, but I think the strait itself, and it's funny because there always happens to be some sort of, narrow waterway when it comes to a declining global hegemon. And we kind of can make parallels to what happened with Britain after World War II when it decided to, the tripartite aggression, where Israel, France, and the UK decided to confront Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt by taking the strait there, right? And we kind of see Trump doing the same thing here, where he thought that okay, we're just gonna go in, this sort of smash and grab victory. And that's kind of been the blueprint since he came to office last year, where they go in very hard and fast. Again, Pete Hegseth and Trump both love talking about this, sort of romanticizing death and destruction and how there's this shock and awe. Element to how the US operates and everything's so beautiful and efficient.
Well,
And
since we're talking about
yeah,
headlines, I don't know if romanticizing is the correct term. I'm not going to repeat anything that was said in Trump's little Truth Social tweet or post today, but it's gone from romanticizing death and destruction to being just very explicit and, for lack of a better term, exceptionally crazy. But yes, go on.
very worrisome. Yeah. And again, his sort of idea was that it would be a very quick fire victory in which they go in, and we have to remember that the Strait of Hormuz was accessible, free of charge, open to every single country before this war began. There was no problems whatsoever with anyone getting anything through that waterway, right? And so the fact that now he's at a point where he's saying we have, or he's threatening Iran with the fact that, okay, you have to open this waterway or else we're going to, visit all this death and destruction upon you. Or I think he said it's going to be hellfire, whatever it is, right? So it's so ironic that that's what it's come to, and it kind of tells you the American mindset, which is consumed by this hubris, this arrogance, and this stupidity, very frankly, because again, the idea is that we're so powerful, we're so, invincible, that we can just do this and nobody's going to be able to confront us about it. Nobody's going to be able to fire back. And the very notion that Iran has persisted in their resistance, in their defense, in overturning the deterrence regionally has been, I can't put it into words how monumental that is, because that has rattled, Donald Trump and the American administration. And so they keep having to, sort of recycle this language about how insane it is, what they're accomplishing, whatever that is, and we obviously don't see the results. And then there's this frustration that builds up, and then he gives these ultimatums and he gives these, crazy deadlines about like if you don't do this, then this will happen. And we see a lot of that, right? But the waterway itself has been exceptionally leveraged by Iran because I'm sure they'd planned for this for a very long time, where it was always quoted as something that was a possibility that Iran would directly impede any, American or Israeli aggression against it by closing off the Strait of Hormuz. But I think people didn't exactly, capture its relevance or capture what it would mean in terms of global infrastructure, in terms of the movement of these resources, the movement of oil, but specifically in terms of, harming the petrodollar, in terms of harming and neutralizing American power. Because what did the US do after World War II? It kind of built itself up by being, the American dollar was what backed oil and all resource allocation that comes out of that, all profit that comes out of that. Everything, every function of every country is dependent on this one resource. And behind that is the US dollar. And that's how it builds its monopoly. That's how it maintains its hegemony financially and militarily throughout the world by having, being tied directly to the most fundamentally important resource in the world. And so Iran basically calls out their bluff. They're like, okay, we notice this, the fact that you are, all encompassing in terms of your economic might, and we can't really take that on. We can't challenge that. But what we can do is to block off this, core, this crux of, it's by the grace of God or something that this little narrow waterway is where all the oil from the region that is, pumping the world's machinery and economies is going to pass through. And it just so happens that Iran, it's, technically it's Iranian territory. It's not international waters, which is something that, is a big mistake that people keep making in terms of assessing this. But it's strategically so well played by Iran in understanding what the ramifications of this will be, because what has happened since then, since they've blockaded this, they aren't just asking countries to pay in Chinese yuan, which is, you know, America's doing in many ways because of the sanctions that the aggressive sanctions regime that they had put against Iran, which left it in a position where they can't trade in American dollars, so they have to trade in Chinese currency. And so now the fact that they're asking for tolls and asking for countries to purchase the oil and to take it through in Chinese currency is a product of that. And so we see these like culmination of these different factors. And I think it's just Iran playing it so well strategically.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it any better. And before we move to the next, topic per se, because I know we have a lot to get through, I did want to make a couple of points kind of building off of what Heather just said. First and foremost, we have to remember that 20%, right, a fifth of the world's oil goes through the strait. So cutting it off, obviously, to, the Western Bloc, predominantly actually like the United States and Israel, because I know there's a lot of countries, and we'll kind of get into this, but there's a lot of countries that have historically always sided with the US, given it military, economic, as well as security based, alliance and help. And this is a war where we're seeing a lot of these allies, right? Even NATO members who helped out with the war in Iraq, who helped out with like other strategic conflicts in the Middle East and other regions, kind of backing out and saying at this point we have to protect our economy. This is a losing battle. But that all being said and done, the fact that, the Strait is responsible for 20% of the world's oil, I think is very, very significant. We also have to take into account that on the very first day of the war, or maybe it was the second day, but within the first day or two of the war, the first thing that was bombed was a girls' school where, and last time I checked, and I could be wrong, Heather, please let me know, but 168 girls, young girls, died as a byproduct of it. And the reason this is so significant is the fact that when these Iranian protests were going on, which a lot of information has developed about, the architecture and the frameworks of them, but when these protests were going on, MSM was basically pushing this narrative that the reason we must go into Iran is first and foremost because it poses this nuclear threat, because it, causes quote unquote regional stability in the area, which is ironic because the one key player that's creating this regional instability has been Israel over and over again. We've seen that historically, especially in the last few years. But they also said that they cared about the fact that the regime is not respecting women's rights, and there's human rights violations and X, Y, and Z. And the first thing that they do, right? This wasn't something later on in the war. The first thing that they do is go after civilian infrastructure, where 168 young girls died. And I think the sad thing about all of this is what we're seeing going on in Lebanon, what we're seeing going on in Iran, what is, no different than what we saw in Gaza. This is not, something new. I think this is actually their blueprint and their playbook.
Unfortunately, yeah. I mean, it's step by step, play by play, the same thing, and I think that's exactly what happens because once you allow one thing to be normalized in one place, it's going to be easy to replicate in another. And as you pointed out, we heard so much, as we always have, about the need to liberate Iran, the need to free Iranian women in particular to save their futures, their collective futures, to better their conditions. Um, it was such a large talking point in Western media, the narratives around this sort of, quote unquote, liberal feminism and the need to liberate these women that uh, by irony, like I can't believe that it was by chance because we now know that they specifically targeted that girls' school. The fact that they kill 168 young schoolgirls on the very first day, almost to kind of, poke
foreshadow
fun
what
at
they've been doing, right? Like they've gone after
that.
orphanages, they're going after hospitals, which is something we saw them do in Gaza. And at first, Israel was blaming it on Hamas. I'm sure you remember that whole ordeal. And we saw,
We heard that same thing here too.
yeah. And we saw that hospital. I mean, I still remember that image. We saw the hospital and the doctor standing outside, literally surrounded by like hundreds of body bags, pleading with the world to, make this stop, and how much of a humanitarian, catastrophe this entire thing was. And as opposed to there being an end to it, we basically saw Western media, we saw Israel claiming that, Hamas did it, and, they were hiding in the tunnels and X, Y, and Z. What ended up happening as a byproduct of all these investigations and all the bombings and like the accelerated genocide? They basically found out that, Hamas wasn't behind it, it was Israel. And then Israel used that as a ploy to continue bombing hospitals. It wasn't, just an oops accident sort of, situation. It's something that they continued doing over and over and over again. And now we're seeing, that playbook kind of unfortunately, come to light in Iran and in Lebanon. And this all has to do with, the greater Israeli expansion project. But there's a headline that I think is really important to kind of go over as a byproduct of, these various different military alliances, defense pacts, the sanctions, the genocide, obviously the axis of resistance, Iran being the nucleus of it, and the various different, key players and countries in the region, who some of them aligned with the Western Bloc, some of them aligned with Israel, some of them, stayed independent and remained anti-imperialist in nature. Maybe not the countries themselves, but the factions within them. As a byproduct of that, we're kind of seeing these multipolar shifts come about in the region and globally speaking. What do you kind of, or how do you kind of feel about these shifts and what's going on at the very moment?
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. It's very, I don't think we could have really foreseen the way or the magnitude of the shifts and how quickly they would happen. And I think, as you pointed out earlier, we're already seeing that again, Iran has neutralized the petrodollar to a point, and obviously blockaded off that strait to the point where American allies are put into a position where they're forced to choose between siding with the US but harming their own economies and being able to ultimately sustain themselves versus, being free of that but having to earn the wrath of the United States. I'm sure, at least in terms of being communicated that. And I think we're already seeing, countries like Italy, countries like France, who are directly negotiating with the Iranians to figure out a way in which they can access oil through the strait, because they understand that long term, this isn't something that's going to be to their benefit in terms of siding with the US, in terms of sitting back and just waiting for them to pull off whatever sort of miracle victory that they assume they would be able to do in the first day or two, or however long they still think it's going to take. Um, and the European Union in particular, because of how Trump has treated them, how he has spoken about the EU, how he's spoken about NATO countries in terms of, the money that the US pumps in to keep that alliance functional, and feeling that they don't do enough. So it's kind of all coincided to this point where now European powers in particular are saying that, okay, we're really not gaining anything from this. We're actually suffering as a result of having to kind of follow America's dictate. Why should we continue to pursue this any longer when we can carry on for ourselves? And so
And
that's
this
the
is
first
while
point, right?
everyone's watching the United States have their petrodollar collapse, and while,
Yeah.
the world is watching Israel and the United States. I mean, obviously, it's I wouldn't say it's an opinion, but it's very obvious that Israel and the United States is not performing as well as globally everyone thought they would, but definitely not to the magnitude that they bragged that they would. And because this is turning into something that's a losing battle, both in the long term and the short term for these individual countries, I think a lot of them are now looking at what's best for them. And we're seeing this we're seeing this with China, we're seeing this with Russia, we are seeing this with, NATO allies that have historically always aligned themselves with the United States, but we're also seeing this with, you know, players that weren't really significant in past situations. We're obviously seeing this with Pakistan. We are seeing this actually just very recently with India. And we are 100% seeing this with the GCC. I think that region, those eight, nine countries in the GCC have always aligned themselves with the West, have military bases, allow, the United States to, utilize its airspace to, strike Iran. But as a byproduct of, these decisions that they made, they're feeling the ramifications of it on a, in terms of their infrastructure, in terms of their banking, their economy, their civilian areas. And they're suffering greatly as a byproduct of it, which is kind of making them sit down and rethink their decisions and alignments. And we're seeing it all kind of play out in real time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's the point, right? Because Iran is showing the rest of the world that if you choose to align yourself and be a party to Israeli and American aggression, we're not afraid to bomb you, right? Like quite literally bomb you and to specifically harm your infrastructure that you depend upon. And I think within a month, we've already seen just the sort of havoc that that's wreaked, and then the sort of destruction that that can have on a larger scale, because there have been moments where specific sites that have been targeted partially have already, with I think with one of the natural gas fields or facilities in Qatar, it's already been estimated that they lost 15 years worth of output because of that one small portion of the facility being hit. So I think that is the blueprint for Iran basically now, is that this is the sort of power that we hold, and you make your choice. And of course, the GCC countries have largely, in terms of the UAE or Saudi Arabia, have kind of stood by the US and said, we're going to continue to be an ally. We're going to continue to work with them because of whatever, I'm not sure what exactly they've been sold, but they've been sold some sort of vision. And it's ironic because the partnership that these Gulf monarchies enjoy with the US, it is a byproduct of the 1968 war, right? And of the US telling these countries that we're going to be present within your territory to protect you from Israel, because that was the point where Israel defeated Egypt and Syria and was able to kind of flex its muscle, even though it was only the result of the US heavily arming Israel to take on these countries, right? And obviously there was this whole thing about communism spreading of the Soviet bloc growing in terms of a united Arab Republic through Gamal Abdel Nasser. And so they sold them this idea that we need to be present militarily permanently inside your countries in order to protect you from Israel, which right now is a complete inversion of that, right? Um, and it's such a sort of crazy ordeal that you have this situation where the UAE is so aggressively standing by their position, where they're saying that a week or two ago you had their foreign minister saying that we're going to be doubling down on our relationship with the United States and Israel. We're going to be even stronger in our partnership. This is while they are subjugated to daily, missile strikes against key infrastructure, against various, components of their economy and their state. But it doesn't seem to have, nagged them to say, okay, we're actually going to take a step back or reevaluate, as some of the other few Gulf nations have. But I think, again, Iran has played this so expertly in terms of understanding what can they do in this situation, how can they cause a rupture to American hegemony in the region? How can they kind of flip and reverse the deterrence that the US enjoyed? And they've kind of done it in this way. And it's a strategy that obviously long term it's going to have, you know, a lot of different effects. But in the moment, we've already seen the sort of repercussions of it taking place very quickly, very fast. Because as you alluded to, countries like India have already reached out to Iran to kind of work a way around things, despite their history of very strong relations in recent times with both the Trump administration as well as with Netanyahu.
No, absolutely. I feel like we have so much more to cover, but we are out of time. So we are going to call it a night. Of course, if you have any questions, concerns, if you see any headlines that you want us to decode per se, if you want us to actually get into the history of certain things so you understand what brought us to this very moment, I'm sure by the time you guys see us again, we're going to have a multitude of new headlines to kind of decipher through. But that all being said and done, if you do want to reach out to us, email us, contact us. Heather, please let people know where they can follow you on social media or reach out to you if they have any questions or concerns.
Of course, yeah. My Instagram is Hatherverse, Haydar verse, and my Twitter X is Chronic Ali here. And you can, yeah, feel free to reach me out on either.
And you actually have an amazing Substack. Do you mind just plugging that in as well?
Yeah, it's Heatherverse as well. So you can find me on there. I'm hopefully gonna be writing a lot more. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've actually, as well versed as I think I am in certain topics, I've learned so much from you. So thank you, so much. And of course, guys, if you want to reach out to me, I am on Twitter. I'm going to spell it for you guys if you want to follow me. It is INTREPIDLOTUS. And then I am also on Instagram at Heena Lotus. I am also on Facebook, also Heena Lotus. And if you guys have any questions, concerns, you can also reach out to me. My email address, especially if you want to collaborate, you have questions, whatever the case may be. My email address is hinalotusmedia@gmail.com. And if you want to see me have a Substack, please put it in the comments below because I tell myself I'm going to do it every day and I don't. So maybe you guys will push me to do it. But again, please share, comment, subscribe. It helps us tremendously. We want to make sure that news and headlines through an anti-imperialist perspective, especially, as Muslims, as South Asians, our, voices, our concerns, the way that we are, shifting through all the news and disinformation, information warfare, honestly, that's going on. I think it's just really important to get this knowledge out there so we can all learn and grow with each other. But that all being said and done, thank you so much for, joining us. Hopefully in the future we will be live streaming, so it'll be a little bit more interactive. We plan to grow this platform in a multitude of different ways, so please look out for that. But that all being said and done, have a great night and, hopefully we'll see you guys again very soon. Thank you.